Sustainability can often seem like a depressing catalog of doom and gloom. But although we face serious challenges, a better and more sustainable future is possible. Welcome to Sustainable Planet.
Welcome to this episode of Sustainable Planet. I'm political scientist Kimberly Weir, and my co-host is Jordan Dye, a guy who knows an awful lot about sustainability issues. Energy propels our world, fueling everything from daily commutes to global industries. Yet 1/3 of total energy produced is used to mine, refine, and transport fossil fuels. What's more, these processes and delivery, along with the use of fossil fuels, exacerbate climate change. Short of changing our lifestyles, shifting to sustainable energy sources is vital. But, Jordan, are all sustainable fuels equally viable, offering a genuine step forward, or are we just clinging to buzzwords?
No, as we're going to look today, they're not created equal. And I think the interesting part is each option we're going to go through today has its own challenges and some similarities. Looking at the moment, there's not a deep penetration of any of these. So I think it's fair. I understand why people think it sounds like a buzzword, because when you point out to it, but hopefully by the end of this episode, people see my most techno-optimistic side today. And I can convince a few that we're on a path forward.
So since this is your area of expertise, right, you've been doing this for several years now, exclusively almost. And so I'll be providing, obviously, the layperson's approach to understanding sustainable fuels. So just like, what do you mean by decompression? You didn't say decompression. You said
decarbonization?
No, you said, what's the other D word you just said?
Oh. I don't know.
Decompacting? No. I think we're going to have to do that bit again. You just said, I forget what it was. But, Jordan, are all sustainable fuels equally viable, offering a genuine step forward, or are we just clinging to buzzwords?
Well, I think that they're definitely not created equal, and each one is going to have their own challenges and their own pros in the system. One thing we talk about a lot at work lately is that there's no silver bullet, there's silver buckshot. I think that's what we're going to go with today. So as we sorry.
I realized as soon as you stumbled. But Jordan, are all sustainable fuels equally viable, offering a genuine step forward, or are we just clinging to buzzwords?
No, each sustainable fuel is definitely not created equal. Each are going to have their own challenges and their own pros. So as we go through this, I really understand why people might think it's a buzzword. There's no real deep penetration of any alternative fuel right now. But as we're looking forward, people are going to see my most techno-optimistic side. And I hope by the end of the episode, I can convince you that there's a genuine path forward.
Yeah, and because this is Jordan's area of expertise that he's pretty much fairly immersed in for several years now, I think I'll probably end up being sort of providing the layperson's approach to understanding sustainable fuels and trying to keep Jordan grounded here for the rest of us who don't necessarily know all the lingo and like everything that's going on with all things sustainable fuels.
I have a note here today that says acronym soup, so I'm going to hopefully avoid that.
That's, as a political scientist, I always felt like that was our world as well. Like if you didn't know the acronyms, you were not going to be able to have a conversation with a political scientist.
And you take it for granted, honestly, when you deal with it. So
yeah, I think it's true for anyone who ends up in a discipline where they're just so immersed in it that they just end up, that's part of their lingo and their everyday discussion. And they get to somebody who's not in their little inner circle, in their silo, and they're like, oh, wait, what?
Should we define, I guess the first acronym of the day is sustainable fuel itself.
Yeah.
So all sustainable fuels, while they're different, as we're going to get into different categories, they're all essentially created from some sort of renewable material and not a fossil fuel. That's the key distinction amongst all of them. One thing that I think you should keep in mind kind of as you're judging sustainable fuel options is whether they're neutral or negative in their carbon emissions. And then both at the top category. So we can talk about, biofuel as an example in a minute. And that can be neutral or negative as a category, but then each process really can drive that. So just like anything else, just because it has the potential to be negative doesn't mean that it can't be done in a way that actually drives emissions.
And so basically what you're talking about is using fuels instead of coal, natural gas, petroleum, which make up a lot of the biggest sources of energy, right, that come out of the ground, And in the case of petroleum, it requires a lot of refining and emits excessive greenhouse gas emissions. So we're talking about fuels that are coming from renewable resources with minimal emissions or are even carbon neutral. In some cases, are actually can help to reduce carbon emissions that are already there.
That's right. And there's two primary use cases for sustainable fuels. The majority we're going to talk about today is in the transport sector, both and not so much personal transport. So, most people are familiar with electric vehicles, and that's really driving the decarbonization of personal transport. So we're going to talk today mostly about, airlines, buses, heavy transport, that kind of industrial side. And then is also as well the industrial use of fuel. So you mentioned, coal and natural gas. So one of the things that sustainable fuels are a promising option for is actually decarbonizing the steel and cement industries that rely on a lot of currently fossil fuel.
Yeah, and in a recent study, it just found that 99% of all U.S. coal plants are more expensive to continue running than to replace with solar, wind, and other energy storage resources, right? So we really need to shift to these sustainable fuels because there's actually a real economic incentive here for governments and businesses to do this. And especially with the rapid explosion of AI development and the increased demand and energy consumption is only going to get worse. And prior to AI taking off, I had read that the energy demand in the US and other global north countries had kind of basically plateaued out and there wasn't an expectation for a lot of growth. And then AI just within a really short amount of time just completely drastically changed that.
Yeah, it's really interesting. The last 20 years of electricity has been almost stagnant. So the amount of reductions because of efficiency has kind of matched the amount of growth. But if you look back at the 90s, there was about 2% annual growth in electricity use. It was a great business to be in, and that stalled out. I do see the massive demand coming from data centers. Just one thing that I find interesting, though, is we thought this before with the rise of the internet and the mass build out of the original, I guess, data centers and what we needed to support that infrastructure. And so those didn't materialize because the data centers and the technology companies had the incentive to reduce their electricity use and other sectors of the economy. So I do also just caution when people talk about the data centers driving the mass, because we've been there before.
Well, and like you just said, 2% increase in the 90s. And that clearly corresponded with the rise of the internet, right? So perhaps these numbers are being blown out of proportion.
But we should still see a rising growth of electricity overall. Well, and just energy. And that's really what we're focusing on today is, electrification is a part of it and is important for all of the fuels we'll talk about. But this is really looking at still liquid fuels and their role in a sustainable economy.
And so when we talk about sort of what would you say are the main fuels that we're talking about here that we're going to look at?
Yeah, so there's a couple we can go over today with three primary ones. So the first one is biofuels. I think people are going to be the most familiar with this or have heard the most about this. And, from the ethanol percentage that everybody is filling up currently in their vehicles to, I know biodiesel has been something I think I've heard about for 20 years from people sending me videos. So biofuels are derived from either agricultural waste, wood stock, or dedicated crops. So already, if you can hear the dedicated crops cringe in my voice, that's a big thing with biofuels.
Oh, me too. And biofuels, I know from my research in international political economy that they got a lot of attention in response to the oil crises in the 1970s in the United States, and not just the US, but the OECD countries overall. And that research was really ramped up and subsidized by governments trying to find alternatives, options, right? And so this is like what we just talked about in the last episode with critical minerals, that governments are worried about supply chain security. And we see the same exact thing going on here.
Yeah, and it wasn't just like the US. Brazil became a leader in biofuels as a result of that crisis and investments in it. And it's actually a great story and unintended consequences that let a lot of mass deforestation came out of that in a drive for both energy security and a more sustainable product. So we'll dive into biofuels a bit more in a minute, but the second kind of category of sustainable fuel is hydrogen. Now, this gets really complicated really quick because there's a rainbow of hydrogen that we can talk about. So when we're talking sustainable, green and white are considered the sustainable hydrogen. So what that green hydrogen is hydrogen produced from water and renewable energy. So it's the lowest emission of the produced hydrogens. White hydrogen is essentially natural hydrogen. So this is getting more and more attention recently as hydrogen has kind of increased on the sustainable fuel radar. But this is concentrated to areas that have natural reserves. So looking at it as a broad solution isn't really feasible.
Now, is that the same thing as what's considered geological hydrogen?
Exactly, yes.
So if people have heard of geological hydrogen and the 50 companies that are currently exploring geological hydrogen reserves, then that's the same as white hydrogen.
Exactly, yeah.
Because like green, it needs minimal processing, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I think the funny thing with all the colors of hydrogen is, they started with green to kind of separate it from fossil fuel because we've been producing hydrogen for a very long time. And our industrial processes are set up to make smaller amounts of it for other use cases. So green was created as a marketing term to differentiate for a sustainable hydrogen. And then the next one that's most oftenly talked about is called blue hydrogen. So this is debated on whether or not it's truly sustainable because it's created from natural gas. So it's taking natural gas and turning it into hydrogen. Now there's two forms of natural gas hydrogen. Blue includes carbon capture and storage. So that's where the debatable claim comes from because most carbon capture and storage processes can't get above at a theoretical limit of around 90%.
Of which there is a lot to talk about with this topic alone, and we're going to do a whole episode on it. So.
A whole episode, yeah. At least there's some trying there, is kind of what I would say. And then the gray hydrogen is just natural gas to hydrogen with no capturing of the emissions. And then finally, one that's not talked about often, but I wanted to include the full rainbow for everybody, is brown hydrogen, which is created from coal methane reforming. So that one is just out. No one should be doing that. And we're going to stick today talking about primarily green hydrogen, though, as a sustainable fuel option.
Now, I've heard of blue hydrogen, but that's the same as gray hydrogen, right?
No, so blue has the carbon capture. It has to have carbon capture and storage attached to it, yes.
But it's still the same sort of like gray in that it's like the gray in that both of them are actually still producing carbon dioxide.
Yes. And because you're taking a natural gas feedstock and basically doing steam methane reforming to turn it into hydrogen. And so and that produces a lot of emissions, plus all the emissions associated upstream with that natural gas.
Yeah. And I just want to point out that in the process of talking about these different sources of renewable resources, hydropower is one that doesn't end up in this group because even though it's widely used and considered a renewable resource, it's just devastating on the environment and displaces populations. And so there ends up being a lot more damage. And I think there are probably some others that I'm sure you're familiar with that are along those lines too.
I don't think you'll see a lot of large scale hydro built in the years. And as you said, Canada, just as an example, the reason why our grid is 86% clean on a country level is because of our vast hydro resources. So, and it's interesting because that factors into the so we're talking there about, primary energy, electricity that can be used in each of these processes to make the sustainable fuel. And so when you're getting your energy from a system like hydro, you do have to account for those other negative impacts. And it's often not done. And I think in the same way, it's actually one of the problems, the environmental side sometimes makes in not counting our own externalities. We're very focused on the carbon externality, but often don't want to talk about, some of the major, massive ecological damage that has resulted from dam building.
Now, if some of these things are already in place, though, like nuclear power plants already in place, hydrogen power already in place, is that actually better just to use those as a primary source of energy to promote and to produce green energies? Or
Yep. No, if you have emission-free energy, decommissioning that to build something else does not make sense at the end of the day. So,
and then that way, that externality, that damage has already a lot of ways been done, except for storing the nuclear, rods.
And at the end of the day, the only way to reduce that kind of damage per unit of energy is to maximize the amount of energy that you can get out of it, right?
Of course.
And this is kind of actually, it's similar It's almost like the environmental side of the economic conversation, right? Like you're trying to divide out that investment by the amount produced. And so everything is going to have an impact. I remember years ago, I was sitting in a class, this is university days, and we had a guest lecturer in to talk about a new framework for sustainability. And their definition of sustainability was only if it had no impact whatsoever on anything.
How do you do anything that has no impact? You're just not actually considering the externalities, right?
I know. I mean, I remember laughing. Like, I remember being like, well, then we're done. Okay, then we lose. There's nothing sustainable and we can all go home, right? Because I think so it really does. And even as right now, we're kind of just talking about these as broad categories, but we'll dive into some of the pros and cons in a minute. And that comes to like balancing it out, right? So, and understanding those cons and how we want to use them in the system.
So in addition to biofuels and hydrogen, green hydrogen specifically, and white hydrogen where it's available, what other sustainable fuels have we got?
Yeah, so we got the last category, and it's the farthest out. So, and most people probably have not heard of it. It is known by two names, either electrofuels or synth fuels. So
As in synthetic.
As in synthetic. That gets a little weird because there's synthetic oil and there's already synthetic fuel. So I went with electrofuels, and that's the term we'll be using today. This is created through renewable processes, so using captured CO2 and renewable energy and hydrogen. So the reason it's the farthest out is it actually relies on all the base systems we've kind of talked about to make a new liquid fuel. There's two primary methods, either combining a CO2 feedstock, with hydrogen to create that fuel, or using microorganisms to convert captured CO2 into a liquid fuel biologically. Although that one's a really interesting process, when we start talking about some of the scale challenges, that one really hits some walls quickly. So I think primarily when we're talking electrofuels, you're talking about that CO2 and hydrogen being combined. And again, to create a liquid fuel that can be used throughout systems.
But if I'm understanding you correctly, one of the cool things about this process actually taps into the excessive amount of CO2 byproduct we already have from the fossil fuel industry, right? So then it makes it into a new fuel. So kind of along the lines of what we were just talking about with pre-existing greener type energies, that this is something that actually, to be green, it needs to do something that renewable energy and green hydrogen and split these things and mix the CO2 and synthesize, hence the name, right, into a clean gas and energy source. But we're trying to actually taking carbon out in the process, yeah?
Yeah, so actually there's two ways you can get that feedstock. One is direct air capture, so directly removing it out. So in a way you can think of, I guess the great analogy would be using the emissions from the last, 2 centuries of fuel to make the next century of fuel. If that's, if there's somebody working in electrofuels who wants a marketing angle. But also the other way is actually captured CO2 on industrial processes. So we talked about blue hydrogen needing carbon capture and storage. One of the barriers to, both direct air capture and carbon capture and storage is the cost. And a problem there is that when CO2 is just a waste, right? When the only option is to store it, then it really limits the incentive for firms to invest, right? You're looking at the government stick option there. And now I think one of the interesting and kind of cool aspects of electrofuels is that drives the use case as a feedstock. So now you've turned a waste into a feedstock. That incentivizes a lot of those industrial companies that have that now as a massive resource, because now it's, again, waste to resource changes the incentive structure.
And so when we talk about all these things, then where does electrification fit into this grand scheme of sustainable fuels?
I think that so there was a recent report from the International Energy Agency, and we talked about them a bit on the last episode, called The Age of Electrification. And I really think that's what we're in. So electrification, in the same way almost every topic we've talked about today kind of drives the emission profiles, that's where electrification fits in here. It is the base that can enable all of these. So again, when you think of both the hydrogen production and electrofuel specifically, those are energy intensive, right? And again, the math on the end fuel being either carbon neutral or carbon negative only works if you're using emission-free energy sources. So we need, we kind of talked a little bit about data centers at the top and the amount of energy that they're going to need. That's just one industry. So you think about switching our fuel consumption, so from gasoline over, as you mentioned, currently that's done a lot with fossil fuels. We use fossil fuels to get fossil fuels in a lot of cases. Now we're talking about using electricity to get fuel. So it really drives the massive build out that's needed.
So this is basically the process of replacing technologies that use fossil fuels with technologies that use electricity.
Electricity, and then or biofuels. So that's because there's still some cases where we need that liquid fuel, and that's what electricity can't do. It's really amazing, but I guess the best way to say this is aviation and buses, right? They're really limited by the size of batteries.
Right, because you'd need a ginormous battery, right? When you think about the size of a battery that's in an electric vehicle.
Yeah. No, exactly. So there's some cases where we actually just can't electrify, right? So even though we're in that age of electricity, we're going to hit up against the wall of, no, we need to have an energy dense liquid fuel source, and we can't be doing it with fossil fuels.
And so so we can have electric vehicles, heat pumps, stoves, induction stoves, and so forth, right? Clothes dryers and things like that, that this would help to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. They'd be more efficient. They could reduce energy demand. They could obviously improve air quality, right? Because there are no exhaust fumes and so forth. And I just saw this write-up in Bloomberg Green about this induction stovetops, right? But they start at $6,000. So clearly, as you just said, that this is like kind of brings it all together. And yet, like along with electrofuels, like we're kind of far off from this being something that the average person can afford.
Exactly. No, and I think in the short term of the fuels we're going to talk about today, most people have an experience with biofuel in the form of ethanol in their vehicles. But by the end of the episode, I think I have a few examples of how you might, and especially Kimberly, because I know you love your international travel. There might be some sustainable aviation fuel options available for you.
Right. And this is why when you started at the outset, you said that right now, most of the progress and research and development and so forth that's going on and where these sustainable fuels are actually being implemented and used much more readily are in the industrial scale.
Yes. Yeah. No, but it's also because the cost. So because personal transport and electrification is honestly just cheaper at the individual scale. So even though you talked about those new induction ranges being $6,000 and at the very high end, when you look at heat pump options, they're currently in a lot of jurisdictions, it is on par with a new air conditioner, but then your actual end use savings are better, right? So these options are becoming more prevalent, but on the sustainable fuel and on the switching outside, the costs are significantly higher. And so it's prohibitive as an option for getting people into it, especially when electric vehicles have made so much, right?
And that's the average person can afford an electric vehicle, right? I mean, that's something, or a hybrid at least. And I mean, I read an article recently about, or because a few years ago I saw, and more recently that there are 1.73 million electric rickshaws in India in operation. Because, I mean, that's the way that if you've ever been to India, like most people get around a rickshaw, it's a lot easier if you've, the traffic jams, like they give entirely new meaning to what a lane actually constitutes. They've got lines, but nobody follows the lines. Craziness. And so a lot of people go by rickshaw. And so to actually, this huge demand of population, over 1 billion people in India, getting them into rickshaws that are electric, like that's a huge difference. And so those are affordable things. When we start talking about, okay, how are we going to fly people around? That's where things get a little bit more challenging. Or how, like you said, we are going to try to decarbonize the steel industry or the cement industry.
Or even one a little closer to home is electric buses were kind of the first option for cities in their pilot programs. And since 2021 and really accelerating, we've seen a switch away from that toward hydrogen buses. So one of the big reasons there is the infrastructure. So you need way more charging infrastructure on an electric system, but the hydrogen fuel cell system can be centralized. So there are problems with transporting hydrogen, but from the city's perspective, the build out, it's actually more cost effective to go with hydrogen buses. So again, I think that we got to be thinking of that silver buckshot. I really love this analogy because you hear about the silver bullet all the time, and this is my most techno-optimist episode, but like I cringe when people say like this is the thing that's going to save us, because we're getting away from that centralized system. Like if you think about it in a way, fossil fuels was the thing that propelled modernity in a lot of ways, that gave us energy density at low costs. So that silver bullet of modernity actually put us in this problem. And we need to be moving away and balancing off in a better system.
And so when it comes to the direction that we're heading with for example, you mentioned with the hydrogen buses, like, okay, the only hydrogen cars really in the United States are concentrated in California because they need the hydrogen fuel refueling, reselling stations. I don't even know what they're called, right? We don't have anything like that where I live in the middle of nowhere, right?
No. Although I think that listeners will be amazed by the top 4 states that of hydrogen bus penetration. So 2 you'll get, and 2 you'd never guess.
So I know, like I said, I know with cars, it's California. Like that's it. Most of the hydrogen cars, and that's where the fueling stations are. But I don't know about
so if you had to guess the others, California, yeah.
New York.
Yeah. Okay. So 2 easy ones. Now 2 hard ones.
Chicago. Omaha.
Not that far off. Texas and Florida.
Okay. Oh, Omaha's not even right. I started naming cities. Sorry, I was thinking cities. No,
it's okay. But yeah, Texas and Florida are round out the top 4 for hydrogen penetration, and this is because cities are leading the way, and they're looking at their own climate goals. And again, the nice thing about it is once you've seen pilot projects in enough jurisdictions, it's really easy for mid-tier cities to start replicating those and then make those kind of cost benefits. So I think, and Europe is really leading in the support for hydrogen buses, but the US is rapidly outpacing them just by the city stepping forward with it, not so much, the federal kind of directive.
And certainly what we talked about with climate anxiety and climate change and insurance premiums and all of those places that are getting hit by just extreme weather, it makes sense that Texas and Florida would be two states that will be really interested in doing pretty much whatever they can to try to decrease climate change effects.
Yeah. But so we kind of give the outline. I think maybe we should dive into the pros and cons, because at this point, if you're just thinking, well, these sound great, why don't we just replace fossil fuels, right? So I guess, keeping the same order, starting with biofuels, the pros is most people kind of could guess, right? They're renewable. We can make them from renewable sources. So both the kind of input, whether that's waste or feedstock, and then the energy, and they're a drop-in solution. So this is really important when we're looking in the short term, is whether it can be used.
You probably need to explain what drop-in solution is, because I know what you mean, but does everybody know what you mean?
No, so that's really in the short term, we need to really worry about whether or not it can be used in current technology. So that's what we mean by drop-in, is can you go put it into a airplane in the case of aviation fuel? Can you put it into a generator system in the case of that industrial kind of energy? Or in buses, can you put it into a bus? As you can guess from the earlier one, buses are going with all new. But on the consumer side, trying to reduce emissions, you need drop-in, going back to your point of not everybody has the money to upgrade a vehicle right tomorrow, right? So, but that leads to, those are the pros. It's kind of, easy to use and we know how to do it. The cons of biofuels, though, and why these have been around for a long time. So it's always, why haven't we seen them? And it really comes down to the cost is still prohibitive. After decades of research on biofuels, we have not been able to drop that cost curve significantly. And then the environmental damage is really the main thing that I worry about, which is, both deforestation to grow them, but then also just we still have food insecurity around the globe. And so it becomes a question of, should we be using land for crops to actually feed people, or so that, Kimberly and I can have less emissions on our morning commute?
Yeah, and that's the thing. My commute's now zero, so I am a net zero commuter, carbon emitter at this point. But yeah, and so I think with biofuels, one of the things I always liked kind of the biodiesel, not from ethanol, but when I was in Swaziland, which is now Eswatini, I visited recycled glass. They make glass, and they collected glass bottles from around the country, and people got money for bringing them there and so forth. And then they recycled them, and they did hand blowing and stuff. It's really cool. And one of the things they also did, there are a lot of KFCs in various places around the world. And South Africa is definitely one of them. Southern Africa is one of them. And where you don't even see McDonald's, you see KFCs. It's unusual.
Number one fast food chain in China. Yeah.
Yeah, yes, in China. And so it's also interesting to me, entirely different, but I got to mention that it's much more likely to see that than a McDonald's in many places too. Where I have been, it's unusual that KFC is more likely if you're going to see one, and it's one of those places where you and I would say, "Oh, we'll get that on the way home for dinner." I wouldn't because I'm vegan, but you get it for dinner. Whereas for people in developing countries, even emerging economies, like that's a special outing. So you would actually go there for like a celebration or special event, not just for like I need to make something for dinner. Yeah, and so I always find that interesting. I'm reminded of that. But one of the cool things about this recycled glass place was that they fueled their furnaces using biodiesel that was collected from cooking fuels from KFC and other restaurants and other places that made, I don't know, institutions and so forth that had recycled oil because that was, cheaper for them. So some people are going to be doing this just because it's cheaper, but when we started talking about this as something that's done exclusively for producing ethanol, and this is something that just has always griped me because the U.S. Farm Bill is like the most arcane and antiquated and every other A word you can think of to throw in there with this, it's a nightmare to try to change. It only gets reviewed every 5 years. And so the subsidies for the ethanol industry in the United States, as I'm sure you know, go back, right, to the farm bills when there was an excess. So again, food security was really important for United States, Japan, European Union, Europe after World War II because people had experienced a lot of rationing and shortages. And so these countries decided they were going to make sure that there weren't going to be food shortages. And so they started subsidizing farming out the wazoo. And so we end up with these outdated policies still hanging around. And by the 1970s, you've got this heaping piles of corn all over the United States, excess corn production. So what do? So the U.S. government ended up supporting research and development to use this excess corn. One of them was another horrible thing, corn syrup. The other one was ethanol, right? So it's two of these horrible things coming out of these food crops that aren't even edible because this kind of corn is not the kind that you eat corn on the cob, right? So like, what do you do with this stuff? Well, and then, so you were talking about this being a downside and causing deforestation and so forth. But on the upside, one thing Brazil did was that because there was a huge demand for soy, that when they produced their soy, in the 1980s, the government that went in, the authoritarian government that went in, actually did amazing strides in economic development, which is why Brazil is as advanced as it is today. And one of the things they did was to figure out and generate soybeans that would work in Brazil. They would grow in the conditions there. And so they have 2 seasons, sometimes 3 seasons, but they set up this really great linear production mode. So it was really super efficient. So they aren't using soybeans for the ethanol. They're using all the byproducts of that. And they're set up in this chain that go along basically from where the growing happens to the processing and then right to the port. So this fuel can be exported to wherever it needs to go. So soybean biofuel production in Brazil is 93% efficient than U.S. corn ethanol, right? So when we're looking at the downside of biofuels, in my opinion, it's like, yeah, they use land and water and agricultural inputs and stuff that could be used to feed people. And, big agribusiness benefits the most from this. And they get all the subsidy money. And they're the ones who are contributing to the pollution and the greenhouse gas emissions and so forth. But if this is done in the right way, it can actually be, because if you're only using waste products, right? If you're using the waste products from the sugar cane or sugar beet, because I know that for the European Union, sugar beet's that's a big thing for them. Palm oil, soybean oil, and so forth. So when you look at the main producers of biofuels and you see that the U.S. is the biggest supplier, right? Again, the government subsidies and so forth, but Brazil, the second largest producer, about 20%. Indonesia, though, because it's one of the biggest palm oil producers in the world, is third at producing biofuels. But they only produce 1/4 of what the U.S. produces, which is a huge amount, right? And so So yeah, sorry, Jordan's got to be able to. I got to let us say him something here.
No, and it's great. I think you're adding a lot of color to it, right? Because like and I knew this was a hard one because I'm like, what does everybody need to know? And I'm still at that high level. So I think this is great, and like it's a great point, and it ties into what we talked about at the beginning about judging each method under a stream in its own way. And you're 100% right. In fact, in the States, the only jurisdiction that has primarily used lipids and fats for its biofuel is California, because they actually incentivized it over using kind of. So when you talk about biofuel, first generation biofuel is just dedicated crop, right? Already on second generation and third generation, which are waste crop, and then moving beyond that to fats. But as you mentioned, the federal system does not incentivize moving beyond that first generation technology. And so it's really important to look at that. One of the problems, though, is that when you're looking at even the second generation kind of waste products, the biofuel is 70 to 130% more expensive than the fossil fuel alternative. One study in Europe was looking at a 50% biofuel mandate by 2030. And found that it would increase the cost of driving by 35 to 62% for that 50%. And so when we're thinking about, it can be done better and it can be a significant emission or a reduction, I think you run into the problem of adoption because of cost.
Yeah, and I am like you. I'm optimistic about a lot of the sort of potential for these things, but it's the cost, right? Always that is the one. And I am a fungi lover. I love mushrooms through and through. And that's one of those things too. Mushrooms, I think really when it comes down to it, mushrooms are going to save, fungi is going to save us all from everything, right? Because there's fungi biobutanol, which is also like a fourth generation biofuel, like super cutting edge coming from algae and bacteria and stuff like that. And I mean, but right now the money's not there.
So I was going to say, I know about algae biofuels. So, because that's usually mine, like algae is going to take over the world. I didn't know about the mushrooms, the fungi one. That's really interesting.
Yeah. And the thing is even if industries wanted just to shift to biofuels exclusively, there's not nearly enough out there to meet demand. And then if there was an incentive, if there were more government incentives to move this direction, it would just end up eating into food security, right? Food crops and so forth. And so that's something that's like, if we're going to try to hedge our bets and what's going to be the best sustainable fuel, that's probably not the direction we want to move, unless it's in conjunction with what's already being produced and using the byproducts exclusively.
Well, and before we leave biofuels behind for this episode, because there's our kind of our last talk, or for now, I think that the small scale is an interesting case for it, especially in developing nations, where there are agricultural byproducts, right? You can do it at a smaller scale. And like, as you noted, right, running generators off of it can be cheaper than actually getting diesel in because you can produce it locally. So I think there's some really interesting biofuel use cases in distributed systems and at smaller scales.
And that's the thing too, that I think it's really important. And it's funny that you're the one who mentions this instead of me, because I'm always the one who's talking about developing countries, right? That when it comes to global south, these aren't countries who are trying to figure out how they're going to deal with their aviation, their aviation projections for how to meet climate change accord, whatever agreement. No, they're dealing with like, how are we going to get people off of generators? Because diesel generators are just vile. I have come across them so many places, and diesel fuel is so prohibitively expensive for people. I've met people who literally, like a village will buy a generator and they will charge cell phones because everybody's got a cell phone. There might not be smartphones, but they've got flip phones, right? So they've got a cell phone that they charge off of it so they can get like weather information and send some messages to people, and also what the going rate is for whatever the commodity is that they sell, right? So they've got that, and they charge maybe one refrigerator because they need some things that are cold or whatever. But in the grand scheme of things, they hardly charge anything because it's just so expensive for them. So this is the sort of thing that would be great for them.
It would be amazing. And I think the diesel generator problem gets even worse at that kind of next scale, where it's the kind of enough development to like be able to afford a citywide diesel generator, which you see as the next kind of like step. And it's an amazing thing. Energy security should never be knocked. But I think the problem is that we say diesel generator and most people still think that kind of small diesel generator, when you get to that next scale, you're talking 22-foot tall, like massive diesel generators, and both the cost and the emission impact, right? So any option that can get that kind of, small kind of municipality down to individual communities off of diesel, I think is something that has to be looked at.
And so how about hydrogen? What are the pros and cons of hydrogen, would you say?
Yeah. So the big difference between hydrogen and the other fuels we've talked about is at the point of combustion, there's only water vapor. So there is not another addition. Now, water vapor has its own warming potential, but we're going to leave that aside for today. And Kimberly gave me a look. I'm not diverging. We're going to just talk about it as the zero CO2 emission. And the other benefit of it is that it's energy dense. So now on mass, it's energy dense. The problem is in volume. It's not. Gasoline's still better. But this is really interesting for industries that need heat and energy, such as steel making. The hydrogen has a really great use case there. I also think that it has a great use case in places where you don't have to ship it. So this is a lot of the problems, and we'll get into in a second, come from shipping hydrogen. So one of the best use cases I've seen being looked at is actually ocean transport. Because you can make it, you make green hydrogen with renewable offshore wind and water from the ocean, and store it right there to be loaded on the ships for shipping. And shipping fuel is bunker fuel. It is one of the worst things that is still burnt on this planet, and with abandon. And we don't. So I think hydrogen's a really interesting case there.
Yeah, and I mean it's also lightweight fuel, right? So it's optimal for transportation, anything in transportation, whether it's air, sea, land, whatever, like you were talking about with the buses and so forth. And DHL, I know that they already have a fleet of over 300 vehicles, or a fleet of vehicles, I think it's in the UK, that can go over 300 miles without refueling, right? So this is something that's good for that.
And it works better in the winter. So hydrogen's another reason why, especially Northeastern and New York, went with hydrogen buses over electric vehicles, is again that centralized refueling, right? So you only have to have one infrastructure project for that, and then works better in the winter. So that it's another benefit to it, especially. But the problem is the building out of the infrastructure to get that hydrogen has been really delayed. And that gets into, I think, some of the cons, which is high production costs. We have to really start with there. And again, for everybody listening, one of the bait and switches that can be done here really easily is we keep saying hydrogen. We've dropped the green at this point because it's just easier. And a lot of industry proponents want blue hydrogen, which again is that natural gas with carbon capture and storage. And the reality of that being effective comes down to how well it'll actually capture that carbon and what the emissions will be. And in most cases, I think that it's not going to be a sustainable fuel. And then people will talk about bridge fuels. I don't want to go too far, but really, if we're making massive investments in infrastructure, I don't think we should be doing it in areas that are going to be obsolete in 20 years. We should be putting that money into systems that can actually be sustainable. Some of the actual problems with hydrogen, though, are just that it's incredibly corrosive. So something, if you're in the industry, you talk about it a lot, but people don't, is that it's about 10 times more destructive to pipes than natural gas due to the size of the molecule. I had one engineer describe it to me as they just want to get through everything and they can. And that's the problem with hydrogen. So you're looking at significant infrastructure costs. And one of the things I point out to my more fossil fuel supporting friends is if you think that, renewables are expensive, which, they're not. But if you think that, do you think we're going to replace the infrastructure 10 times more often than we do now with natural gas?
We can barely keep up now, right?
Exactly. And then you get into, so there's different ways to store it. There's only, two, gaseous or liquid. In its gas form, it takes much more space to store it. So that's again.
Well, you said it's got big molecules, so.
Oh, well, small molecules. Sorry, no, it takes more space to store it for the amount of energy we need. Because that's on a mass scale, it is more dense, but on a volume scale, less dense than gas. So to your earlier point about drop-in, it's not a drop-in solution. You'd actually need new vehicles, or in the liquid form, you can use fuel cells, but that requires compression and cooling tanks, which you get outside the realm of being economically feasible. So
it's not like we can just have gas that's piped into our houses that then can just be, now we just go from that infrastructure to having hydrogen storage tanks at our houses?
No, the best I've seen is a 20% blend. You kind of top out there. Interestingly enough, the Trump administration in its final year invested $1 billion in research on a pipeline coating so that you could just coat the current pipeline network. Although, as we're going to talk about electrofuels, I think this is a great segue because I think hydrogen's really good at static use cases. So if it can be if the production can be co-located with the end use, really great. Or for centralized transportation systems, again, where you don't need multiple distribution points. And then finally, as a feedstock into other things. And that's really, again, because it's centralized co-production and you avoid a lot of the problems with storage and transportation.
I know you had a really busy week last week and you've now started your vacation, but did you see that the report that Bloomberg just put out estimating that the cost for green hydrogen is now 3 times more what they initially projected for 2050?
No, I missed that.
Yeah. And the higher projected costs are due to the cost of the electrolyzers, which we hadn't actually talked about, but that makes the green hydrogen, right? And then the stalled out current projects, because there are a bunch of that have started and then they're just kind of hanging out there, right? And then also the lack of government support, especially the US government commitment on tax credits. So companies are kind of waiting to have that same incentive. Like, are you going to give us subsidies? Are you going to give us tax credits, right? To move in this direction. And as long as those are stalled out. So right now, Bloomberg is saying that, I went to Bloomsburg University. So Bloomsburg is like Bloomberg and Bloomsburg, like, if you hear me, like that's the difference there. My slip. So yeah, they're thinking now it's going to end up costing a lot more. But on the upside, I also read that green hydrogen is projected to be much more likely available and cost competitive in China and India by 2040. And that's really good because when we look at the whole world in terms of carbon emissions, those are 2 countries where there are a lot of carbon emissions coming out. And so that's going to be on par with blue hydrogen. And so that's something that will also help. Another thing I think of when it comes to this is that at least what I knew about hydrogen is that it's highly flammable, right?
When it's compressed.
Yeah. And so that's kind of like, you start looking at that and people are like, oh, no, right? So if people are concerned about, have concerns about switching to sustainable fuels and they heard these horror stories that are probably anomalous for the most part, but they're like, oh, no, I can't have a hydrogen car because, man, I'm just going to hit somebody and my car is going to explode.
Well, and that's why you see hydrogen fuel cells as the method there. And you're right, but it's why you won't see a natural gas line to your house, that natural gas range that a lot of people love. You won't see that replaced with a hydrogen range because of that problem of once it is ignited, it can lead to uncontrollable ignition throughout back up the pipe. And that is, we don't want to go there. It's also can be, again, when you do the compression and cooling, it can be very safe. So I know that there's somebody out there from the hydrogen industry who's throwing some things. I want to say it's not all Hindenburgs, but the risk is there for a reason.
I didn't even think of the Hindenburg, but yeah.
I can't get through a conversation on hydrogen. But no, I had missed last week's research from Bloomberg, and I'm going to check that out. Thank you for that. But it doesn't surprise me at all. We already knew how expensive it was in general. The fact that because I think also you mentioned that it was by 2050. So that's accounting for the scaling that they assume is needed in other pathways. And it's why I said a moment ago that when you hear hydrogen now, it's usually blue hydrogen that people are trying to talk about. And even that, again, I don't know of any built projects producing blue hydrogen. So it's really gray hydrogen that might become blue. And so again, that's the natural gas produced that might get the carbon capture and storage.
And blue is still misleading because blue sounds nice, but it's not green.
No, exactly. It's why I think actually the term in the US clean energy is most often used because right and left like it, because the left thinks zero emission energy and Republican kind of leaning people think natural gas because it was branded as clean energy for the last 20 years, right?
And so if we have some hope of where we're going to have some real change, what would you say our real hope is here in terms of what can make a big dent on adopting and making sustainable fuels something that will really help us to achieve and mitigate climate change issues?
Yeah, I think that it's going to be in our non-personal lives. So the big hope for me is in aviation and then city transport. So, kind of touched on buses a lot today. I think that that's probably going to be the easiest option for the average American, whether, no matter of income level. You can look around the country now and there are already hydrogen buses on the road. So going forward, as we see it move from pilot to kind of full deployment scale, we're seeing annually doubling of the amount of buses going out, and from even more than that, from hundreds a couple years ago to thousands on the road now. So that gives me some hope that we'll see that. And that's a major boon for cities, right? When they look at their own emission reduction goals. And then more broadly for consumers, it's a sustainable aviation fuel, because aviation's, while it's only about 2% of global emissions, depending 2 to 4, depending on estimates, it's something that is only increasing. And it's one of the first ones when people, I think, throw at most people, why do you still fly? Or if you like sustainability. But it's also, I fly for work. I can't tell my job that I'm not getting on that plane to go do my work. And so that gives me hope. And we've also, the rapid increase we've seen in that industry. So this is my techno optimism is kind of the learning curves we're making on some of these really get me excited. It was only 2008 that the first sustainable aviation fuel test was ever done. It was one engine on a Boeing 747 from London to Amsterdam at only a 20% blend. Right. So since then, every airline manufacturer has shown that sustainable aviation fuel, which is a form of biofuel, sorry, just so people, I didn't explain that. It's a form of biofuel, but every airline manufacturer can do a 50% blend on it. And actually in 2023, Virgin Atlantic did the first 100% sustainable aviation fuel flight. So it's really exciting. And it's also not made from a crop feedstock. It's woody biomass and waste from paper, pulp mills, and our wood production. So again, it's using something, as you mentioned, if it's already using a feedstock that we would have had anyways. Sorry, I'll throw it back to Kimberly because I know you like to fly. How do you feel about that?
No, I was going to say, like the one thing I had heard about, I've been reading about this too. And, of course, every time I book a flight, they're like, do you want to do your carbon offset? And I'm like, I have issues with carbon offset. And, I feel like a lot of the times when we talk about sustainability issues, as we've mentioned before, is it puts the onus on the consumer. It's always on the consumer. You should be responsible for your air, oh, petroleum prices have gone up, so now we need to charge more for flights. And so we're going to tax you for that because, we're going to go out of business if we have to foot this bill, of course, right? So I saw recently that the European Union had mandated that airlines buy. So this is something that's happening, right? January 1st, as of January 1st, 2025, the European Union mandated that airlines must use 2% of sustainable aviation fuels. I keep wanting to say avian flu, which is very bad, but that's been in the news a lot, right? So, but I can't say it.
The acronym is SAF. They are called
so
SAF.
Let's just go with SAF, right?
Yeah.
So for these fuels that starting January 1st, 2025, it's a mandate that, so this is an incentive for carriers and industries to ramp up this production. But of course, now Lufthansa comes along, Lufthansa Cargo, and I'm sure many others say, well, we're going to have to add a surcharge now because we can't possibly bear the cost of this without blending, this blending surcharge. And so the international relations person in me says, well, if there was one policy, which is what the European Union is trying to do, one policy that everybody has to obey by this one policy, then nobody's getting shortchanged because they all have to take that same hit. So Lufthansa Cargo isn't going to be able to charge any less than what DHL Cargo is going to be able to charge. And in fact, I read that DHL actually leads the world in SAF adoption. And so the thing is, though, that in 2023, and in all fairness, since it really only started 2008, this is probably pretty good. But in 2023, it only accounted for 3.18% of their overall fuel need, right? And they're the leader. So think about then the next step in terms of biggest cargo shippers is FedEx. Then we've got Amazon, who knows, right, where they're going to fit into all of this because they're not just cargo shippers per se. So if the leader is only at 3.18%, then, how long is it going to be till this is something that is realistically going to be able to be that 50% of fuel mix that it can be?
Yeah, and there's a couple great things there. So one, to give the SAF industry a little credit before I pour a bunch of cold water on this, because I started out hopeful because I'm to be honest, right? So, but It is growing rapidly. So in 2022, it was only producing 300 million liters of fuel. That has ramped up to 1.2 billion by 2024. So we're seeing annual doubling on doubling, which is great, but that's only 0.3% of all global aviation fuel. So we haven't even cracked 1%, right? So I think the question of when. Now, this gets to the industry pushing back, and I get that, economic actors have to try to maximize their value. But that's why I love looking at industry association plans, because you can see what they have collectively agreed to and has made it through their lawyers and their corporate teams, and it's the bare minimum. Well, their pathway sees low penetration, only hitting 13% SAF fuel by 2035, which is in line with the EU's, right? So, and actually, if you look at the EU targets, it's 6% by 2030 and 70 by 2050, which the industry has 75% fuel by 2040. So again, this is the government's not doing, and you kind of made the point. It doesn't seem ridiculous. It's early. These are low targets. And that's within the industry's timeline. So I always like to look at those to push back a little, right? When they start saying surcharge, because you've agreed you can do this. But to that point, it's not going to be a major contributor anytime soon. So the industry, the International Air Transport Association, IATA, they've committed, and this makes up most of the major players from manufacturers to actual operators. They've committed to hitting 75% penetration of SAF fuels by 2040. And I think that it really flips around 2035 by their projections. Up until then, now they're still going to be claiming to meet their climate targets, but their plan has them purchasing 78% carbon offsets and removals up until 2040. So it's not there yet, but I think that seeing the doubling, and then as you said, seeing multiple companies purchasing, and then the mandates, that's what gives me hope here, is that the foundations are there and we're seeing it.
I think when it comes to actually trying to implement any of these things, we end up seeing, with the pros and cons, we also see the barriers and what are the incentives that are out there, especially when it comes to government. And some of the things we've talked about are like, there are a lot of vested interest with long established government relationships and joint research and development projects and lobbying and concerns about losing constituents with policy changes and so forth if politicians back these. And all these factors can make it really difficult to try to move in this direction, eliminating subsidies or eliminating tax benefits or even implementing new tax benefits and so forth. And like I mentioned with the U.S. Farm Bill, it's just, I'm sure there's a Canadian Farm Bill too, right? And
yes,
and so these are things that when we look at globally, the IMF estimates that fossil fuels subsidies are at $7 trillion, right? And so China's funding is the most astounding. 12.5% of its total GDP is subsidies for fossil fuels. And the United States is second. And then we've got Russia, which isn't surprising, and India, because they need the energy. And yes, even the European Union is up there, right? The European Union has increased its fossil fuel subsidies because even after its commitments to the COP26 in Glasgow, they had to up it because of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And so then we look at even countries like, then we've got the Middle East. So not only are they not wanting to give up this fossil fuel production, but they also live in really stinging hot places. And so they have some of the highest fossil fuel subsidies per person to keep energy costs low in those countries. And in fact, Qatar has free electricity for its citizens. It reminded me of when I came across this, of the Soviet Union and how it was ostensibly free. We had a neighbor who married a Kazakh woman who he was just maddened by. Her showers would just be draining the hot water tank every single day for 20 minutes because when she lived in Kazakhstan during the Soviet, when it was Soviet Russia, that it was under Soviet Union, that was free. They didn't have to pay for that.
Yeah, no, I think that I often think of the old Roman saying, bread and circuses. You keep the people happy, give them bread and circuses. The modern era, no matter the political system that's running the country globally, I think you could say bread and gasoline. You need cheap food and cheap gasoline. That is what keeps people happy. And while, we noted today, biofuels, 70 to 130%, right? Hydrogen, 3 times more expensive than the already 3 times more expensive estimate, right? So they're not there on cost now. we need the investment in the industrial build out. That's what's going to drive down the cost, right? So, and I think that to your point on a lot of this, the average person is not going to have any influence on the US farm bill, right? The average person, and that's why politically the pressure needs to be up, right? But I think sometimes it also leaves us feeling like we can't do anything, or we have to really sacrifice to do something, which in people's competing lives, there's a lot going on. And that's why I do like the idea of being able to take a hydrogen bus when I'm in New York City next time, as part of that everyday experience of it, right? Or as you noted, there are already a few airlines that are that have higher penetration than others, right? Now, and they're still cost competitive with the other airlines. So if I can direct some of my flights and reward that, that's something that at least, again, I'm going to take the flight either way, as I said, for work, right? So what are the small shifts that I can do to be helping in my own small way accelerate this adoption?
I think that this also goes along the lines of a lot of what we've talked about, which is that industries themselves, in many cases, have incentives to do this with or without government backing, interference, intervention, whatever, because it's just much more cost efficient and effective for them. But where they can get those additional subsidies and tax benefits and so forth, that's even more encouragement. So I think when it comes down to just looking at fossil fuels and the fossil fuel issue overall, it's really definitely much more a system level, higher level. This is not about what the average consumer. So like I said, I always feel like the onus is on us for a lot of things. On this one, it's like, okay, so we got a hybrid vehicle. That's probably, that's one thing that we can do. We could take if people in Cincinnati could actually use public transportation to efficiently get anywhere, then yeah, great. It would be great to be able to use hydrogen buses. But in the grand scheme of things, what we're really looking at is there have to be some advancements made industry level, government level for any real wins here.
Yeah, no. So I know when we normally close out episodes, you throw it to me. What am I hopeful for going into it? But I thought for this one, I'd throw it back to you before we close out. Did I convince you a little that there's some techno optimism on the horizon?
Yeah, I think so. I think that thinking back through, I really like, of course, the mushrooms, like way far off, but the green hydrogen seems promising if we can get to the point where it is a little bit more cost efficient to do so. And the biofuels, I think that's something those are already in place in a lot of ways. We've got a lot of waste, right, that we could turn into biofuels. And why not? And especially if we could use some of that carbon capture to do some of that. It gets a little more complicated, in the grand scheme of things, but definitely using anything that's already out there. And certainly there are companies that are doing this and trying to make this work. And if somebody can figure it out, they're going to make a mint. If they can make it to scale, it's going to pay off. It's just a matter of getting to that point.
Can we hit that? Yeah.
No,
and I think that's the real question. Like, it's promising. And unlike some areas where you look and it's a mirage when you poke behind it, I think there's a lot of real promise here, but there's no guarantees. And there's not even guarantees for any of these pathways that we will be able to, reduce those costs enough. So,
but for now, it will keep you in a job, right?
Exactly.
If you enjoyed our episode of Sustainable Planet, or even if you didn't, let us know at usplanetpod@gmail.com. We're also on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, and YouTube. You'll find these shows, notes, and links in our show notes on our website, usplanetpod, along with additional resources from today's episode. You can also read more on my Substack post, which is awesome, if I do say so myself.
It is pretty great.
Thank you. We'd really appreciate it if you'd rate and review Sustainable Planet on your podcast app. It only takes a minute and it'd really help us out. Thanks for listening and have a sustainable day.